Kitten rescued from river forms unbreakable bond with rescuer. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The river was relentless. The water churned violently, twisting through rocks and branches as though it were alive, hungry for anything caught in its path. The sound was deafening, an unrelenting roar that consumed everything around it, drowning out the peaceful hum of the forest. Somewhere within the chaos, nearly hidden by the spray of rushing water, a tiny figure clung to life. A kitten, no more than a few months old, fought desperately against the current, its sodden fur clinging to its small, frail body. Each wave seemed determined to pull it under, battering it against stones and tree roots that jutted out like jagged claws. From the trail above, a lone man stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been walking this route for years, a familiar path through the dense forest where he found solace in solitude. But this was something he'd never seen before. At first, he hadn't been sure what had caught his attention. Perhaps it was the faint, frantic cries carried on the breeze, so soft they barely rose above the sound of the water. But when he looked down at the river below, his blood ran cold. It was a kitten and it was drowning. "Are you serious?" he muttered to himself, scanning the scene frantically. For a long moment he stood there, his mind warring with itself. Logic told him the river was too strong. One wrong move and he would end up like the kitten, helpless at the mercy of the current. But something else, something deep and impossible to ignore, pulled at him. The kitten let out another desperate mewl, its little face barely visible as it clawed against a thick branch swept along by the current. Its blue eyes were wide, terrified, an unspoken plea. That was it. That was all it took. Before he fully realized what he was doing, he was already moving, his boots skidding on the muddy slope as he half ran, half slid toward the water's edge. His breath came in short bursts as adrenaline surged through his veins. The river loomed ahead, wild and uninviting, but the man didn't hesitate. He yanked off his jacket, dropped it in the grass, and stepped forward. The water was freezing, shocking his body the moment he plunged in. It wasn't just cold. It was numbing, biting through his clothes and skin like icy needles. His lungs seized for a split second, but he forced himself forward, driven by the image of that tiny, helpless creature. Each step was a battle. The river tugged at his legs, trying to pull him under, but he pushed through, his eyes locked on the kitten ahead. "Hang on, little one," he muttered, as if the kitten could hear him. The water pushed against him with a strength that nearly knocked him off his feet. But he fought back, teeth gritted as he waded closer. Every second mattered. The kitten's small claws had found purchase on the thick, mossy branch, but it wouldn't hold for long. A single slip, one strong wave, and it would be gone. Closer now. He was closer. The man stretched out an arm, his fingertips just brushing the branch when a powerful wave slammed into his side, knocking the breath from his lungs. For a terrifying moment, he was underwater, the current spinning him like a rag doll. His body struck something hard, a rock or a branch, before he managed to right himself, gasping for air. His head broke the surface, and for a heart-stopping moment, he couldn't see the kitten. His chest burned, panic flaring in his veins. Then he saw it. Just a little farther downstream, the kitten was still there, clinging to the branch, but its strength was failing. Its tiny body sagged, water streaming from its fur, and its eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, were starting to lose focus. No. The man pushed forward again, using every ounce of strength he had left. The water felt heavier now, like lead pulling at his limbs, but he refused to stop. His heart thundered in his chest as he reached out one more time, this time his fingers wrapping firmly around the branch. The kitten startled at the sudden jolt, its small claws slipping. "I've got you," the man breathed, his voice shaky as he reached forward with his other hand. Gently, carefully, he scooped the tiny creature into his arms, cradling it close to his chest. The kitten was trembling, its little body so light he was afraid it might break, but it was alive. The man turned back toward the shore, his movements slower now, each step deliberate as he fought against the water. His arms ached, his legs felt like they were made of stone, but he didn't care. He could feel the faint rise and fall of the kitten's chest against his palm, and that was enough. By the time he reached the riverbank, he was gasping for breath, his limbs trembling with exhaustion. He dropped to his knees in the wet grass, holding the kitten close as water dripped from his clothes and hair. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The kitten didn't make a sound. It lay limp in his hands, its fur plastered to its tiny frame, and the man's heart sank. "Come on, little one," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't give up on me now." He adjusted the kitten in his arms, pulling it closer to his chest to share what little warmth his body had left. His fingers brushed its face, delicate, almost too small, and to his relief, its nose twitched faintly. The man let out a shaky breath, his heart pounding. "There you are," he murmured, as though the kitten had done something incredible. And maybe it had. Against all odds, it was alive. Barely, but alive. He glanced around, taking in his surroundings. The forest was quiet again, the roar of the river now a distant hum, as though it hadn't just tried to claim 2 lives. The trees loomed overhead, their leaves dripping from the brief storm that had passed through earlier. The air was cool, heavy with moisture, but all the man could think about was the fragile creature in his arms. The kitten stirred, just slightly, its small head turning toward him. Its eyes opened barely, but enough to meet his gaze. They were impossibly blue, like clear summer skies, and filled with something the man couldn't quite describe. Gratitude? Trust? It didn't make sense, but for some reason, it hit him harder than he expected. "You're a tough little thing, aren't you?" he said softly, his voice carrying just above a whisper. The kitten blinked slowly, as if agreeing with him, before its eyes slipped shut again. Its breathing was faint but steady, its tiny body rising and falling against his chest. The man sat there for what felt like an eternity, his arms wrapped protectively around the kitten as he tried to process what had just happened. It wasn't every day that life threw something like this at you. Something so small, so unexpected, yet so significant. He hadn't planned on stopping by the river. He hadn't planned on jumping in to save a life. But now, sitting here, soaked to the bone with a kitten curled against him, he couldn't imagine having done anything else. Finally, the man shifted, carefully pulling off the flannel shirt he wore over his t-shirt. The fabric was wet, but not as soaked as the rest of him. He wrapped the kitten in the soft material, tucking it close before pushing himself to his feet. His body protested every movement, but he ignored it. The kitten needed help, warmth, food, things he could give it if he got home quickly enough. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he muttered, glancing down at the small bundle in his arms. The kitten didn't respond, its eyes still closed, but its tiny paw twitched slightly, resting against the man's thumb. That was enough for him. With slow, measured steps, the man began the trek back up the muddy slope, his legs unsteady beneath him. The river murmured behind him, as though trying to call him back, but he ignored it. Whatever had happened there, whatever had brought the kitten to that place, was over. All that mattered now was the life he held in his arms. The climb back up the muddy slope felt endless. Each step pulled at his muscles, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The weight of exhaustion settled in his limbs, but he gripped the kitten tighter, shielding it from the cool wind that swept through the trees. Occasionally, he glanced down to check on the fragile bundle in his arms. Wrapped in his damp flannel, its tiny body barely moved, its breathing shallow but consistent. The sight filled him with equal parts relief and urgency. "You're going to be all right," he murmured, though the words were as much for himself as for the kitten. "You've got to be." By the time he reached the top of the slope, his chest burned with the effort. He paused to catch his breath, leaning heavily against the nearest tree. For a moment, the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the faint hum of the river far below. The forest seemed to have returned to its usual calm, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. But in his arms, the kitten was proof that the world was never as quiet as it seemed. "Let's get you home," he muttered again, straightening. He cast one last glance at the river, its surface now placid and unassuming, before turning his back on it. The walk home felt longer than usual, though he'd made the trek countless times before. The narrow dirt trail wound its way through the forest, eventually leading to the edge of a clearing where his small cabin sat nestled among the trees. Normally, he enjoyed the solitude of the hike, the way the dappled sunlight broke through the canopy, the sound of birds flitting from branch to branch. But today, every moment felt urgent. He had a purpose now, fragile and alive, wrapped in his arms. As the cabin came into view, relief washed over him like a wave. It wasn't much. A small, single-story structure with weathered wood siding and a roof that always seemed to need repairs. But it was home. The place he'd built for himself after leaving behind a life that had become too noisy, too crowded with ghosts. Here, he'd learned how to live quietly, how to exist with nothing but the sound of the forest and the comfort of his own company. He'd never needed more than that. Until now. He pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside, careful not to jostle the kitten. The air inside was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the damp chill outside. Sunlight filtered through the windows, catching on dust motes that floated lazily in the stillness. He kicked off his soaked boots and set the kitten down gently on the couch, still swaddled in the flannel. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring down at it, unsure of what to do next. Right? Food, he muttered to himself. It felt absurd, talking aloud in an otherwise empty room, but silence felt heavier today. He crossed to the kitchen, a tiny nook in the corner of the cabin, and began rummaging through cabinets. His pantry wasn't exactly stocked for kitten emergencies, but he managed to find a can of tuna tucked behind a stack of soup cans. He cracked it open and scooped some into a small bowl, grabbing a shallow dish to fill with water. When he returned to the couch, the kitten hadn't moved. For a terrifying moment, he thought it might have stopped breathing. He crouched beside it, reaching out to touch its head. The fur was still damp, soft beneath his fingertips, and when he brushed lightly against its ear, the kitten stirred. A faint mewl escaped its throat, a sound so small it barely registered, but it was enough. "Hey, there you are," he whispered, relief flooding through him. "Come on. Let's get you something to eat." He set the dishes on the floor near the couch and gently unwrapped the kitten from the flannel. Its legs splayed awkwardly as he set it down, its tiny paws pressing against the soft fabric of the blanket he'd laid out. For a moment, it stayed still, blinking up at him with those impossibly blue eyes. Then, as if summoned by the smell of food, it sniffed the air and wobbled toward the bowl of tuna. The man sat back, watching in silence. The kitten ate hesitantly at first, its movements clumsy and unsteady, but soon it was devouring the food with surprising determination. He couldn't help but smile. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For hours, he'd carried this fragile life through the forest, terrified it might slip away at any moment. And now it was here, alive and eating like it hadn't seen food in days. "Guess you were hungrier than I thought," he said softly. The kitten finished eating and turned back toward him, licking its tiny lips. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. The man, crouched on the floor, felt an odd sense of connection, like the kitten was studying him just as much as he was studying it. It was strange, the way something so small, so vulnerable, could feel so significant. He'd spent years alone in this cabin, avoiding connections, avoiding people. Yet now he found himself wrapped up in the well-being of a creature that couldn't even speak. "You need a name," he mused, resting his elbows on his knees. The kitten tilted its head, as if considering his words. Its fur was still damp and matted, sticking up in tufts around its ears and along its back, but its eyes were bright, clear, and curious. Something strong, something that fits. He thought for a moment, searching for inspiration. Names swirled in his mind, but none of them felt right. Then his gaze drifted to the window, where the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The same forest where he'd found the kitten. "River," he said softly, the word slipping out before he could think twice. "That's what I'll call you, River." The kitten blinked slowly, then let out a tiny mewl, as if accepting the name. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. River it is, then. For the next hour, the man worked to clean River up, carefully wiping away the last traces of mud and water from her fur with a soft towel. She protested at first, squirming and letting out sharp little cries that sounded far more dramatic than they were. But eventually she settled. By the time he was done, her fur was soft and fluffy again, a mix of grays and browns with hints of orange that reminded him of autumn leaves. She looked healthier already, her small frame no longer weighed down by the river's chill. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" he murmured, cradling her in his hands. She stared up at him, her tiny face so trusting that it sent an unexpected ache through his chest. He'd saved her life, and somehow that fact felt far more important than he could explain. River yawned, a soft, squeaky sound that made him chuckle. Her eyes drooped, and he set her down gently on the blanket. Within seconds, she curled into a tight ball, her paws tucked beneath her chin, and drifted off to sleep. He watched her for a long time, his heart unusually heavy in his chest. It wasn't just relief he felt, it was something else, something quieter, deeper. He'd spent so long convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that solitude was the only way to avoid disappointment or loss. And yet, here was this kitten, barely more than a scrap of fur, and she had already wormed her way past every defense he'd built. The man sighed, running a hand through his damp hair as he stood. He grabbed his flannel shirt, still damp but no longer soaked, and tossed it over the back of a chair before crossing to the small wood stove in the corner of the cabin. He lit the fire, feeding it with kindling until the flames crackled and danced behind the glass door. The warmth spread quickly, filling the room with its gentle glow. As the fire burned, he sat down in the armchair near the couch, his gaze drifting back to River. She hadn't moved, her tiny body rising and falling with each breath. For the first time in years, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just a place to exist anymore. It felt warmer, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the fire or the sound of the wind outside. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes as exhaustion began to pull at him. River's faint breathing filled the space between them, steady and calm, and for the first time in a long time, the man didn't feel so alone. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the small window above the couch, painting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. The man stirred in his armchair, his neck stiff and sore from sleeping upright. He blinked groggily, the events of the previous day slowly coming back to him as he sat up. For a brief moment, he wondered if it had all been some strange dream, the river, the rescue, the kitten. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic purring. Turning his head, he saw River curled up in a tight ball on the blanket. Her small body rose and fell steadily, her face tucked beneath her paws, but it was the sound that struck him most. The purring was soft yet constant, filling the otherwise silent cabin with something that felt strangely alive. "Well, look at you," he muttered, a small smile pulling at his lips. He stretched his arms above his head, groaning as his back popped. His muscles still ached from the trek through the river, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that reminded him he'd done something that mattered. Standing up, he padded to the stove and stoked the dying embers back to life, adding a few logs to bring the warmth back into the cabin. River stirred as he moved about, stretching her tiny paws with a soft squeak. Her eyes fluttered open, still glassy with sleep, and she let out a little yawn. When she saw him, her ears perked up, and she pushed herself to her feet with shaky determination. The blanket slipped off her back as she took a few tentative steps toward the edge of the couch, stopping to look up at him with wide, expectant eyes. "You hungry again?" the man asked, crouching down beside her. River blinked as if to say, "Of course," and let out a high-pitched mewl. The sound made him chuckle. All right, you've got a healthy appetite for something so small." He crossed to the kitchen, where the empty tuna can from the night before still sat on the counter. Grabbing another, he cracked it open and scooped the fish into the small bowl he'd used earlier, setting it down near the blanket. River immediately hobbled toward it, her movements still awkward but far stronger than they had been the day before. She dove into the food without hesitation. Her tiny body hunched over the bowl as though it might disappear if she stopped eating. "Slow down," the man murmured, watching her with quiet amusement. "It's not going anywhere, you know." As River ate, the man busied himself around the cabin. He cleaned up the damp blanket and towel from the night before, draping them over a chair near the fire to dry completely. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had this much energy so early in the morning. Usually, his days started with silence, a quiet cup of coffee and the sound of the forest waking up around him. There had been a time when that solitude had been a comfort, a shield against a world he no longer felt a part of. But now it felt different. When River finished eating, she sat back on her haunches, her belly round and satisfied. She licked her whiskers, her blue eyes scanning the room before landing on the man again. He raised an eyebrow as she let out another small mule, this one softer, almost questioning. "You sure talk a lot," he muttered, crouching beside her. She tilted her head, watching as he reached out to scratch lightly behind her ears. To his surprise, River leaned into the touch, her purring starting up again almost instantly. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're going to get used to this real quick, aren't you?" He sat on the floor beside the couch, his hand still gently rubbing the soft fur beneath her chin. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth spreading through the cabin, and the man found himself staring at River, at the way she trusted him so completely. It was strange. He'd always thought animals had better instincts than humans, that they could sense danger or kindness more clearly. And yet here she was, a tiny scrap of fur who had no reason to trust him, leaning into his hand as though he were the only person in the world who mattered. "You really are something," he muttered, his voice low. River responded by climbing into his lap, her paws pressing lightly against his jeans as she settled in. The man froze, startled by the sudden movement, but River paid no attention. She curled up against his thigh, her body soft and warm, her purring vibrating through his legs like a quiet hum. He stared down at her, a lump forming in his throat that he didn't quite understand. For years, he'd been alone in this cabin. He told himself that solitude was what he needed, that it was easier to avoid people than risk losing them again. There had been times early on when the loneliness had been suffocating, but he'd learned how to live with it, how to make it a part of him. And yet, somehow, this tiny creature had slipped through the cracks of his armor without even trying. "Guess I'm stuck with you now," he said softly, his hand resting on River's back. She shifted slightly, letting out a contented sigh, and the man couldn't help but smile. The day passed slowly, the hours stretching out like threads of sunlight. The man spent most of it tending to River, making sure she had food and water, cleaning up the small messes she made as she explored her new surroundings. She was cautious at first, sticking close to the couch and the blanket she'd claimed as her own. But as the hours ticked by, her confidence grew. She ventured farther into the cabin, her paws making soft, pattering sounds against the wooden floor as she investigated every corner. The man followed her movements with quiet amusement, his heart lightening with every clumsy step she took. In the afternoon, he took her outside for the first time. The air was crisp and cool, the scent of pine and damp earth lingering after yesterday's rain. He sat on the porch steps, River perched beside him on the blanket he'd brought out. She stared wide-eyed at the forest, her ears twitching as she listened to the unfamiliar sounds, the rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the faint whisper of the breeze. For a long moment, she stayed still, as though trying to absorb it all, and the man couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. "This is your home now," he murmured, watching her. "All of this, the trees, the river, it's all here for you." River turned to look at him, her blue eyes impossibly bright in the sunlight. She let out a small chirp, almost as if she understood, and the man smiled. He spent the rest of the afternoon chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe splitting logs filling the clearing. River watched from the safety of the porch, curled up on the blanket, her tiny head poking up as she followed his every move. Occasionally, she mewed, the sound carrying across the clearing like a soft reminder that she was still there, still watching. The man found himself glancing back at her more often than he cared to admit, as though needing to reassure himself that she was real. When the sun began to dip below the trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, the man gathered his tools and headed inside. River followed him, her tiny paws patting softly behind him as he moved about the cabin. He lit the stove again, filling the room with the same comforting warmth that had greeted them the night before. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced along the walls, the man found himself sitting on the floor again, River curled up in his lap like it was the most natural place in the world. "Never thought I'd be a cat person," he muttered, scratching behind her ears. River purred in response, her eyes half closed as she drifted into sleep. The man leaned back against the couch, his hand resting on her small body as his gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the forest was dark and still, the faint outline of the trees barely visible against the deepening sky. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. It wasn't just a place to hide anymore, a space where he could disappear from the world. It was more than that now, something he couldn't quite put into words, but felt deep in his chest. River shifted slightly, pressing closer to him, and the man smiled faintly. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring or the day after that, but for now this was enough. "You're a good one, River," he whispered, his voice low. "A real good one." The kitten's purring filled the room, soft and steady. And for the first time in a long time, the man let himself relax. The days turned to weeks, and the man's life continued to change in quiet, unexpected ways. River was no longer the timid, fragile creature he'd pulled from the river that day. She had grown stronger, more confident, though she never strayed too far from him. Wherever he went, inside the cabin or out, she was close behind, her soft paws pattering across the floor or through the grass like a gentle echo of his footsteps. It became routine for them to sit together on the porch in the mornings. The man would drink his coffee, staring out at the forest, while River explored the steps or curled up beside him, purring contentedly. The simple companionship brought a kind of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. For so long, he had lived as though he were the only soul left in the world, but River had filled the spaces he didn't know were empty. One particular morning, as he sat on the porch, a chill in the air hinted that autumn was not far off. River had taken to perching on the railing, her tail swishing as she watched the birds flit between the trees. She'd grown braver over the past few weeks, more curious about the world around her. The man sipped his coffee, a faint smile on his lips as he watched her. "Don't go trying to catch one of those birds," he muttered. "You'll fall flat on your face." River glanced back at him, her ears twitching as though she'd heard every word. Then, as if to prove him wrong, she crouched low, her muscles tensing. With a flick of her tail, she launched herself off the railing, straight into the grass below. The man nearly dropped his mug, jolting to his feet. "River!" By the time he reached the edge of the porch, she was already sitting in the grass, completely unharmed, staring up at him with a look that was equal parts innocent and triumphant. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, shaking his head. "You're going to give me a heart attack," he muttered, though he couldn't help but chuckle. "You think you're bigger than you are, don't you?" River responded with a soft chirp, clearly unfazed, before bounding toward the nearest tree stump and hopping onto it with all the confidence in the world. The man watched her for a moment, a mixture of amusement and exasperation flickering across his face. He'd never been one to fuss over anyone, man or animal, but River brought it out in him effortlessly. As the day wore on, the man busied himself with chores. The change in seasons meant there was firewood to split and stack, repairs to make to the cabin before the first snow arrived. He worked methodically, the rhythm of the axe splitting would grounding him in a way few things could. And though he didn't expect it, River was always nearby, watching from the shade of the trees or playing with leaves that drifted lazily to the ground. It was as though she had taken it upon herself to keep him company, no matter what he was doing. When the man finally finished stacking the wood, his muscles aching from the effort, he turned to find River sitting atop the pile, her tiny body perched like a queen surveying her kingdom. He let out a low laugh, wiping the sweat from his brow. You really think you own this place, don't you? He teased. River flicked her tail, staring at him with those wide, unblinking eyes. He walked over and scooped her up, her soft body warm against his chest. She didn't protest. In fact, she purred loudly, nuzzling her small head against his chin. The man sighed, his smile softening. You're something else, he murmured, the words coming easier now. You know that? Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the wood stove as the man cooked a simple dinner. Something he hadn't done with much care in a long time. He'd fallen into the habit of eating whatever was quick and convenient, but lately he found himself putting in a bit more effort. It wasn't just for him anymore. He had a guest to care for, even if she only ate tiny bowls of food. As he sat at the table with his plate of stew, River jumped onto the chair across from him, watching him intently. Her paws rested on the edge of the table, her head tilted curiously. The man paused mid-bite, raising an eyebrow. You're not getting any of this, he said, though the amusement in his voice betrayed him. You've already eaten twice today. River didn't blink, her blue eyes fixed on him. He sighed dramatically, shaking his head. Fine, just a little. He reached for a small piece of meat, setting it on a napkin and placing it on the floor. River jumped down immediately, devouring the offering with the same enthusiasm she always had. The man chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Spoiled. That's what you are. After dinner, the man settled into his armchair by the fire, a book in his lap. River, as always, found her way into his lap, curling up in a perfect ball as her purring filled the room. The sound had become familiar, comforting, like the hum of a well-worn melody. He ran his fingers through her fur absent-mindedly, his gaze drifting from the book to the fire. For the first time in years, he felt content. The cabin, which had once been a refuge built from necessity, now felt like a home. The silence that had once surrounded him was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was filled with the quiet sounds of life. River's purring, the soft crackle of the fire, the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. The man thought about the river that had brought her into his life. How easily things might have gone differently, how close she had come to being lost forever. He pulled her from the water because he couldn't bear the thought of walking away, of letting something so small and helpless slip away. But now, as she slept peacefully in his lap, he realized that she'd saved him too. His life, which had felt so empty for so long, now had purpose. It wasn't grand or complicated, just the quiet responsibility of caring for something other than himself. And somehow that was enough. The fire burned low, the flames casting soft, flickering shadows along the walls. The man shifted in his chair, careful not to disturb River as he leaned back and closed his eyes. For a long time, he simply listened to the sound of her purring, steady and constant, until sleep finally pulled him under. The next morning, the man woke to the faint weight of River perched on his chest, her face inches from his own. Her whiskers tickled his nose as she mewed softly, demanding attention. He groaned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Morning already? He muttered, his voice rough. River purred in response, her small body vibrating with energy. The man sighed, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he sat up. You're worse than an alarm clock. You know that? River hopped off his chest and padded toward the kitchen, clearly expecting breakfast. The man shook his head, running a hand through his hair as he stood. He grabbed his flannel shirt from the back of the chair and slipped it on before following her. As he poured food into her bowl, he couldn't help but marvel at how quickly she had taken over his life. She was everywhere, darting between his feet as he moved about the cabin, chasing shadows in the corners of the room, curling up beside him whenever he sat down. It was as though she'd always been there, a natural part of his world. After breakfast, the man took River outside to enjoy the morning sun. She darted through the grass, chasing leaves and hopping after insects, her small body full of life and energy. The man watched her from the porch steps, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. She's fearless, he murmured to himself, though there was pride in his voice. He wondered what it was like to see the world through her eyes, to find wonder in the smallest things, to live without fear or hesitation. Watching her made him feel lighter, as though some of that energy and curiosity had seeped into him, too. For the first time in a long time, the man looked forward to tomorrow. Not because he expected anything extraordinary to happen, but because he knew River would be there. And that was enough. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks began to blur into months. The air turned crisp as the seasons shifted, the edges of the forest painted with the fiery reds and oranges of autumn. The man had always loved this time of year, the stillness it brought, the sense that the world was preparing to rest. But this year was different. The quiet felt fuller, the solitude less lonely. River had become his companion, her presence so constant that he could no longer imagine life without her. He found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit. She had grown in the weeks since he'd pulled her from the river, her frame filling out with sleek muscle and soft fur. Her eyes, though still impossibly blue, had lost some of their kittenish innocence, replaced by a knowing curiosity. She explored every inch of the cabin and the surrounding clearing as though she owned it, darting between patches of sun on the floor or climbing the woodpile with practiced ease. Some mornings, the man woke to find River perched on the windowsill, her small body silhouetted against the pale dawn light. She would watch the forest as though it were her kingdom, her tail flicking idly against the glass. The man wondered what she saw out there, what mysteries her sharp eyes picked up that his couldn't. Sometimes, she'd glance back at him, her gaze lingering for a moment before she hopped down to greet him with a soft mew. It had become part of their unspoken routine. "Good morning to you, too," he'd grumble, though his tone always held affection. One morning, as he sat at the small wooden table sipping his coffee, River jumped onto the chair across from him. She developed a habit of joining him for meals, her paws perched on the edge of the table as she watched him eat. Today, however, she seemed more restless than usual. Her ears twitched, her gaze darting toward the window. "What is it?" the man asked, glancing outside. The forest was as it always was, calm, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He turned back to River, who let out a soft, insistent chirp. She hopped off the chair and padded toward the door, pausing to look back at him. "You want out?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. River mewed again, more demandingly this time, and the man sighed, setting down his mug. "Fine, let's go see what's so important." He grabbed his coat from its hook by the door and followed River outside. The air was cold, the sky overcast, with clouds hanging low on the horizon. River bounded down the steps and into the clearing, her small form disappearing momentarily into the tall grass. The man shoved his hands into his pockets as he followed, his breath misting in front of him. River led him to the edge of the clearing, where the forest began. She paused there, glancing back at him as though waiting for him to catch up. He frowned, stopping a few feet away. "You're up to something," he muttered, narrowing his eyes. "What is it?" River turned back toward the trees, letting out another chirp before darting forward into the underbrush. The man's frown deepened. She rarely ventured far without him, never out of sight, but now she seemed intent on something, her movements deliberate as she slipped between branches and fallen leaves. For a moment, the man hesitated. Then, with a resigned sigh, he followed. The forest was quieter than usual, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves that blanketed the ground. River moved ahead of him, her tail bobbing as she wove between trees and rocks, occasionally pausing to glance back and ensure he was still following. The man's curiosity grew with every step. River wasn't aimlessly exploring. She had a purpose. But what could a small cat like her possibly be looking for? "River," he called softly, though his voice felt too loud in the stillness. "Where are you taking me?" She didn't answer, of course, but a moment later, she stopped abruptly. The man froze, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer. River was crouched at the base of a large tree, her gaze fixed on something in the dirt. The man followed her line of sight, his breath catching as he saw what had grabbed her attention. A small mound of earth had been disturbed, as though something had been buried there and recently uncovered. The soil was dark and loose, scattered with bits of fallen leaves. The man crouched down beside River, his pulse quickening. "What is this?" he murmured to himself. He reached out, brushing away some of the dirt with his hand. At first, he wasn't sure what he was seeing, just tangled roots and damp earth. But then he froze. Buried beneath the soil was something unmistakably man-made. The edge of a small, rusted tin box. What the... The man trailed off, his heart thudding in his chest. He glanced at River, who was watching him intently, her blue eyes unblinking. "Did you find this?" River chirped softly, as though answering him. The man shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the unease that prickled at the back of his mind. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" He dug around the box carefully, freeing it from the earth before pulling it into his lap. The tin was old, its surface scratched and rusted, but it was still intact. The man turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges. It was small enough to fit in his palm, the kind of thing someone might have used to store coins or keepsakes. For a moment, he hesitated. He wasn't sure why. There was nothing particularly menacing about the box, but something about finding it here, buried in the middle of the forest, unsettled him. Finally, he exhaled and pried the lid open. Inside, nestled among layers of brittle, yellowed paper, was a photograph. The man frowned, carefully pulling it free. The image was faded, the edges curling, but he could still make out the figures captured within it. A family. A man, a woman, and a small boy stood side by side, smiling faintly at the camera. Behind them was a house, partially obscured by trees. The man squinted, something about the scene tugging at the edges of his memory. "What's this doing here?" he murmured, more to himself than to River. He turned the photograph over, his brow furrowing as he noticed a faint scrawl of writing on the back. The ink was faded, but he could still make out the words. "For when we return. Someday." The man stared at the message, his mind racing. He had lived near these woods for years, had walked this trail countless times, but he'd never seen any sign of another house or family out here. Whoever they were, they had been gone for a long time. He glanced back at River, who had curled up in the grass beside him, watching him with quiet patience. "What have you gotten us into?" he asked softly, though there was no accusation in his voice. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The man tucked the photograph back into the tin, his thoughts heavy as he stood. He glanced around the forest, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Too quiet. River mewed softly, padding to his side as he turned back toward the clearing. "Come on," he said, his voice low. "Let's get back." The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have, the photograph's words echoing in the man's mind. For when we return. What had happened to the family in the photo? Why had the box been buried here, in the middle of nowhere? The questions gnawed at him, though he pushed them aside as the cabin came into view. Inside, the man set the tin box on the table, staring at it as though it might offer him answers. River hopped onto the chair across from him, watching him curiously as he sat down. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "You've got a knack for finding trouble," he muttered, glancing at River. She blinked, her tail swishing lazily over the edge of the chair. The man picked up the photograph again, his thumb brushing over the faded edges. Whoever they were, they had been here once, maybe long before he'd arrived. The thought unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. He had always thought of this place as his, a haven carved out of the wilderness. But now it felt different, as though someone else's story lingered here, waiting to be uncovered. River let out a soft purr, breaking the silence. The man looked up, his expression softening. "Don't worry," he said quietly, setting the photograph aside. "We'll figure it out." River hopped into his lap, curling into a small, warm ball. The man rested his hand on her back, the steady rhythm of her purring grounding him. Whatever secrets the forest held, he wasn't alone anymore, and somehow that made all the difference. The man woke the next morning with the tin box still sitting on the table, its rusted edges catching the light of dawn that filtered through the window. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at it, as though trying to decide what to do. River was perched on the back of a chair, watching him intently with those sharp blue eyes, as though she, too, was waiting for his next move. "You really don't miss a thing, do you?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. River mewed softly in response, her tail flicking back and forth. The man exhaled and stood, walking to the table and picking up the box once again. The photograph and its cryptic message weighed on his mind like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. "For when we return." There was something haunting about those words, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't as though the forest was littered with ghost stories or hidden secrets. It was just trees and quiet, a place where nothing ever happened. And yet, something had happened here. He turned the photograph over again, studying the faces of the family. The father had sharp features, the sort that made him seem stern even in a photograph. The mother's face was softer, though her eyes held something he couldn't quite place. The boy, standing between them, looked about 8 years old, his small smile uncertain. The man stared at the image for so long that it began to feel like they were staring back at him, the edges of their smiles hiding something he couldn't see. He glanced at River, who had padded closer to him now, her paws on the table as she peered curiously at the box. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" he asked. River blinked up at him as if to say, "No chance." Shaking his head, the man grabbed his coat and slipped it on. "Fine. Let's see if we can't make sense of this." River bounded to the door as he opened it, her tail held high as she darted into the crisp morning air. The man followed her, the weight of the tin box tucked into his coat pocket. Outside, the clearing was bathed in the pale light of dawn, the trees surrounding it still heavy with mist. He stood for a moment, taking in the quiet before setting off toward the forest. River trotted ahead of him, her small form weaving through the tall grass with ease. The man retraced their steps from the day before, back to the spot where River had uncovered the box. The forest seemed different today, heavier somehow, as though the trees were holding their breath. The man pushed the thought aside, crouching down when they reached the disturbed patch of earth. He studied the ground, turning over the possibilities in his mind. Had the family buried the box here themselves? And if so, why? The message on the back of the photograph suggested they'd planned to return one day, but it was clear that they never had. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign that there had once been something here. A house, maybe, or the remnants of one. But all he saw were trees. River mewed softly, brushing up against his leg, and the man reached down to scratch her head absent-mindedly. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "You found this thing. What else are you hiding out here?" River purred in response, rubbing her head against his hand before darting forward again, her small body disappearing into the underbrush. The man frowned. "River," he called, standing quickly. "Where are you going?" He pushed through the bushes after her, the branches catching on his coat as he followed the sound of her soft mews. When he finally caught up, he found her standing in the middle of a small clearing he'd never seen before. The trees formed a natural circle around the space, their branches arching overhead like a cathedral. The ground here was different. Flatter, the grass sparse and patchy, as though something had once stood there. The man's pulse quickened. He stepped forward, his boots crunching softly against the earth. River sat near the center of the clearing, staring at him as though she'd been waiting for him to arrive. "What is this place?" the man murmured, more to himself than to her. He crouched down and ran his hand over the ground. The dirt was compacted, harder than it should have been. He frowned, brushing aside the leaves and debris that had gathered there over time. Beneath the surface, he could just make out something solid, something man-made. The man froze. His heart thudded in his chest as he reached for the small trowel he always carried in his coat pocket. It was a habit he'd picked up over the years, useful for clearing trails or planting saplings around the clearing, but now it served a different purpose. Slowly, carefully, he began to dig. River sat quietly nearby, her blue eyes watching his every movement. After a few minutes, the man uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a stone foundation. He sat back on his heels, his brow furrowed as he brushed the dirt away with his hand. The stones were old, weathered by time, but they were unmistakable. This had been a house once. The man exhaled slowly, glancing around the clearing again with new eyes. He could almost picture it now. A small cabin, not unlike his own, nestled among the trees. The family from the photograph had lived here maybe decades ago. But what had happened to them? Why had they left, burying their secrets in the dirt before disappearing? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the tin box, opening it to stare once again at the photograph. "You were here," he murmured, studying their faces. "But where did you go?" The forest offered no answers, its silence pressing down on him like a weight. The man ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. Part of him wanted to leave this mystery where he'd found it, to let the forest keep its secrets. But another part of him, a part he hadn't felt in years, needed to know. River mewed softly, as though sensing his unease. She padded over to him, rubbing her small body against his side before curling up beside him on the ground. The man glanced down at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into a faint smile. "You're determined to drag me into this, aren't you?" he asked quietly. River purred in response, her small form pressed close to his. For a long moment, the man sat there in the clearing, staring at the photograph and the remnants of the foundation beneath him. The world felt different here, heavier somehow, as though the trees themselves were holding onto the memories of the people who had once lived among them. The man wondered what their lives had been like, whether they had been happy here, surrounded by the same quiet and solitude he'd grown to know so well. Finally, he tucked the photograph back into the box and stood, brushing the dirt from his jeans. "Come on, River," he said softly, reaching down to scoop her up. "Let's get back." The walk back to the cabin was quiet, the air growing colder as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The man's thoughts churned with questions, though he couldn't find any answers. River seemed content in his arms, her small body warm and steady against his chest. As they reached the clearing and the cabin came into view, the man let out a slow breath, the sight of home grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. Inside, the fire crackled in the wood stove, filling the cabin with warmth as the man set River down and shrugged off his coat. He placed the tin box on the table once again, its presence now familiar and strange all at once. River jumped onto the chair beside it, her gaze lingering on the box as though it still held secrets. The man sat heavily in his chair, running a hand over his face. "You've turned me into a detective, you know that?" he muttered, glancing at River. She blinked at him, her tail curling neatly around her paws. The man stared at the box for a long moment before reaching for it again. This time, he carefully unfolded the brittle papers that had been tucked inside. Most were too faded to read, the ink smudged or worn away by time, but one caught his eye. It was a map, or what was left of one, scribbled hastily on yellowed paper. A rough sketch of the forest, with an X marked near the center. The man frowned, his pulse quickening. "What were you hiding out here?" he murmured. River let out a soft purr, as though she knew the answer already. The man stared at the rough map, his brow furrowed as the faint lines seemed to swim before his eyes. The sketch was crude, drawn by someone with an unsteady hand, but the X near the center stood out clearly, as though it had been marked with intention. The rest of the page was smudged and torn, making it impossible to tell what landmarks had been sketched around it. His mind raced as he studied the map. Why would the family bury something like this? Had it been a game, a treasure hunt for the boy in the photograph? Or was it something more? Something hidden out here in the forest for reasons the man couldn't yet guess? River sat on the chair beside him, her tail flicking back and forth in quiet curiosity. She watched him intently, as though she knew he was on the verge of something important. The man glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into a faint smile despite himself. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he muttered, though there was no bite to his words. River let out a small chirp, her blue eyes bright as they followed his movements. The man exhaled deeply and folded the map, tucking it carefully back into the tin box. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to take such care with it. Perhaps it was the weight of its age, the thought that it had been hidden here for so long waiting to be found. Or perhaps it was the feeling that he owed it to the family in the photograph to see it through, to uncover whatever secret they had buried so many years ago. The idea lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. He'd spent so long living in this forest, walking its trails and listening to its silence, and yet he'd never once thought to question what might have come before him. The cabin had always been his refuge, a place to escape the world, but now it felt as though the forest was speaking to him, whispering secrets he'd never cared to hear. And River, somehow, was at the center of it all. "Well," the man said finally, pushing himself to his feet. "I suppose there's no turning back now, is there?" River mewed softly, as though in agreement. The man grabbed his coat and the small leather bag he used for hikes, tucking the tin box and map inside. He grabbed a thermos of coffee, an old compass, and his trowel before turning to the door. River followed close at his heels, her paws making soft, deliberate sounds on the wooden floor. "You're coming, I take it?" the man asked, glancing down at her. River paused, her tail swishing as she stared up at him with unblinking eyes. He chuckled softly. "All right then, just stay close." Outside, the morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at his nose and ears but hadn't yet settled into the deep chill of winter. The trees were quiet, their branches bare save for a few stubborn leaves that clung to life. River trotted ahead of him, her small form weaving through the tall grass as they headed back toward the forest. The man followed the trail they'd taken the day before, his thoughts swirling as he retraced their steps. The forest felt different today, not darker exactly but heavier, as though it were watching him. He shook off the feeling and focused on the map, pulling it from his bag once they reached the small clearing where River had first discovered the tin. "All right," he muttered, kneeling to study the rough sketch again. "If this map's to scale what little there is of it, then the X isn't far from here. Maybe another mile, give or take." He stood and turned to River, who sat patiently near the edge of the clearing, her ears perked as though listening for something. "You lead me this far," he said, tucking the map back into his pocket. "You got any more tricks up your sleeve?" River responded with a soft chirp before darting into the underbrush once again. The man sighed, shaking his head with a faint smile as he followed. "I'll take that as a yes." The forest thickened as they moved deeper into it, the trees growing taller and closer together. The man used his compass to keep his bearings, adjusting his path every now and then to stay in line with where he thought the X might be. River stayed just ahead of him, always within sight but moving with a confidence that made it seem as though she already knew where they were going. "You're smarter than most people I know," the man muttered under his breath, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. River paused to glance back at him, as though she'd heard, before continuing forward. An hour passed in near silence, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath the man's boots and the occasional rustle of River darting through the underbrush. The deeper they went, the more the man's unease grew. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense that he was walking toward something he wasn't prepared to find. He tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on the forest around him. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden shards, the faint smell of damp earth and pine in the air. Finally, River stopped. The man froze, his heart thudding in his chest as he watched her. She stood at the edge of a small clearing, her ears perked, her tail held low. The man took a cautious step forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the space ahead. The clearing was smaller than the first, almost perfectly round, with a single tree standing in the center. The tree was massive, its gnarled branches twisting upward like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Its bark was dark and weathered, and something about it seemed off. The man couldn't quite place it, but the sight of the tree sent a chill through him. River padded forward cautiously, stopping a few feet from the base of the tree. She sat down, her gaze fixed on it as though she were waiting for something. The man approached slowly, his boots crunching against the frost-covered grass as he stopped beside her. "What is it?" he murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. His eyes were drawn to the base of the tree, where the roots twisted and rose from the earth like tangled limbs. Something was buried there, he was sure of it. The ground was uneven, the soil disturbed in places, as though someone had dug there long ago. The man swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the trowel as he crouched down. "You've brought me to something, haven't you?" he whispered, glancing at River. She didn't move, her gaze still locked on the tree. The man hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, with a deep breath, he began to dig. The soil was cold and hard, but it gave way easily enough beneath his hands. He worked slowly, carefully, clearing away the dirt from the base of the tree. River watched him the entire time, silent and unmoving, as though she understood the gravity of what he was doing. After several minutes, the man's trowel struck something solid. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he brushed away the remaining soil with his hands, revealing the edge of what looked like another box. This one was larger than the first, made of wood that had been darkened and warped by time. The man's pulse quickened as he carefully lifted the box from its resting place. It was heavier than he expected, the wood creaking faintly in protest as he set it on the ground before him. His fingers lingered on the surface, brushing away the last traces of dirt as he studied it. There were no markings, no hints as to what might be inside. River mewed softly, breaking the silence. The man glanced at her, his throat tight. "What have we found, River?" He exhaled slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for the box's lid. It creaked as it opened, the sound louder than it should have been in the stillness of the forest. The man stared at the contents, his heart stopping as the pieces fell into place. Inside, nestled carefully among layers of rotted fabric, were several objects. A stack of letters tied together with twine, a small carved wooden toy that looked like a horse, and another photograph, this one larger, clearer than the first. It was the same family, but this time their smiles were gone. The father stood rigid, his arm around the boy, while the mother stared off to the side, her face pale. Something about the image sent a chill through the man. He picked up one of the letters, the paper brittle beneath his fingers. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. His heart pounded as he read. We tried to leave, but it won't let us go. The house, the clearing, it's watching. If anyone finds this, please remember us." The man swallowed hard, his gaze darting back to the tree. Its branches loomed overhead like silent sentinels, the forest suddenly feeling darker, colder than it had moments before. River let out a soft, uncertain mew, pressing against his leg. The man looked down at her, his fingers trembling as he set the letter back in the box. "We need to go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. River didn't hesitate. She turned and darted back toward the edge of the clearing, and the man followed, the weight of what he'd uncovered pressing down on him like a stone. The man's boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as he hurried after River, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The box was still clutched tightly in his arms, its weight both physical and symbolic, as though it carried all the unanswered questions of this place. He couldn't shake the words from the letter. "It won't let us go." They echoed in his mind like a warning, twisting through his thoughts until they no longer made sense. The forest felt different now. The air had grown heavier, colder, as though the trees themselves were pressing in around him. Shadows pooled beneath their branches, dark and unmoving, and the silence was deafening. It wasn't the peaceful quiet he was used to. It was something else, something unnatural. River darted ahead of him, her small form barely visible as she slipped through the underbrush. She was faster than he was, moving with the same strange determination that had brought them here in the first place. The man stumbled over a root, catching himself with one hand as the box nearly slipped from his grip. He swore under his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears as he pushed forward. "River," he called, though his voice felt small against the stillness. "Wait up!" To his surprise, River stopped. She turned to face him, sitting just at the edge of the clearing, her blue eyes reflecting the dim light like mirrors. For a moment, the man could almost see the faint outline of the cabin through the trees beyond her. Relief washed over him like a wave. "There you are," he muttered, pushing through the last tangle of underbrush. "Come on, let's—" His words died in his throat. River wasn't alone. In the shadow of the trees, just beyond where she sat, the man saw it. a figure. At first, he thought it was another trick of the light, a distortion in the mist that curled through the clearing, but then it moved. The figure stood still and silent, its outline just barely visible between the branches. It was tall and thin, its form impossibly straight, like it had been carved from the same wood as the trees around it. The man couldn't make out its features. There were no eyes, no face, but it was watching him. He could feel it. The box in his hands suddenly felt like lead. River mewed softly, breaking the spell. She didn't seem afraid. She sat there as calm as ever, her gaze flicking between the man and the shadow in the trees. The man swallowed hard, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run. But he couldn't move. The figure didn't advance, didn't speak. It just waited. Finally, the man forced himself to take a step back. River rose to her feet, trotting toward him with slow, deliberate movements, as though she were trying not to startle him. The man dropped to one knee, setting the box carefully on the ground as River reached him. She rubbed against his leg, purring faintly, as though trying to comfort him. It's okay, he whispered, though the words felt hollow. He glanced back at the figure, still frozen in place at the edge of the clearing. We're leaving, River mewed again, and this time the man didn't hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms, turning his back on the shadow and hurrying toward the cabin. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself were trying to pull him back. He didn't stop to look over his shoulder, didn't dare slow down. He just ran, his heart pounding, River's soft purring the only thing keeping him grounded. When he finally burst into the clearing, the cabin came into view, its familiar shape a lifeline in the growing gloom. The man staggered up the porch steps, wrenching the door open and stepping inside. He shut it behind him with a thud, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. For a long moment he just stood there, his back pressed against the door, his chest heaving. River squirmed in his arms, and he set her gently on the floor. She stretched lazily, as though none of what had just happened bothered her in the slightest, and padded over to the couch where she curled up into a tight ball. The man watched her for a moment, his mind racing. He turned back to the window, his hands trembling as he peered out into the clearing. The forest was still and quiet, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of the figure, no movement, no shadows. For a moment, he wondered if he'd imagined it, if the letter and the photograph had stirred something in his mind that wasn't really there. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He sank heavily into his chair, running a hand over his face. The box still sat on the floor where he'd dropped it, the map and photograph tucked safely inside. He stared at it for a long time, his thoughts churning. He had spent years thinking of the forest as a refuge, a place where nothing could touch him, but now he wasn't so sure. Whatever the family had buried out there, whatever they had been trying to escape, was still here. And yet, despite the unease gnawing at him, the man couldn't bring himself to leave. The cabin was his home. The forest was all he had ever known. And River. He glanced over at her, curled peacefully on the couch, her small body rising and falling with each breath. River had led him to all of this. Without her, the box would still be buried. The clearing would remain untouched, and the photograph would lie forgotten in the dirt. She had found him in the river that day, saved him in her own way, and now it seemed as though she had saved something else too. The man stood, crossing the room to pick up the box. He set it carefully on the table, staring at the photograph one last time before tucking the letters and map back inside. He didn't know what the family had been running from, or why the forest had felt so heavy with their secrets, but he knew one thing. The box didn't belong out there anymore. Whatever had happened in that clearing, it was time to let it rest. The man glanced out the window again, his gaze lingering on the edge of the forest. The trees were quiet now, their shadows no longer watching. He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing just slightly. "Looks like it's just you and me again, River," he murmured, turning back toward her. River lifted her head slightly, blinking at him sleepily before curling back into a ball. The man smiled faintly, shaking his head. He sat down in his chair, the fire crackling softly in the stove as its warmth filled the room. River's purring joined the gentle sounds of the cabin, grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. Outside, the forest stretched on, endless and unknowable. But for the first time, the man wasn't afraid. He didn't know what secrets the trees held, or what shadows still lingered in the clearing. But he knew one thing for certain. River had brought him here for a reason. She had pulled him from the river that day, saved him when he hadn't even realized he needed saving, and she had led him through the forest, piece by piece, until the truth was uncovered. And now, as the man sat by the fire, listening to the rhythm of River's purring, he understood. The forest would always hold its secrets, but some things didn't need to be explained. Sometimes the smallest lives could save us in ways we could never imagine. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting closed as the fire crackled softly beside him. River shifted slightly, her small body warm against his side, and the man let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest finally easing. For the first time in years, he felt at peace.